Good evening. Can everyone hear me? I'm Christina Olson. I know some of you, but I'm the very new director at the University of Michigan Museum of Art here. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight for the second lecture in our three-part series, Curatorial Dilemmas, Representing Africa at UMMA, which broadly explores the challenges and opportunities of displaying the arts of Africa in museum contexts. It's a timely topic, and as many of us in here know, but visitors sometimes don't, who come to museums, the art displayed in museums very often wasn't made for it and can live uncomfortably, physically, conceptually, ethically within it. That's especially true for much of the African art that's displayed in museums. And these days, museums are grappling with how best to acknowledge that and accommodate it and maybe play with it. University art museums, I think, have a special opportunity, obligation even, to tackle those questions and chart new ways of thinking and curating through those problems and opportunities. And so with that, I think I would like to introduce Laura de Becker, our Helmut and Candace Stern curator for African art. Laura.
Thank you so much, Tina, and especially thank you for so graciously agreeing to welcome everyone tonight. For those of you who don't know, it's Tina's 4th day on the job, so it's absolutely amazing that you're here tonight. My name is Laura de Becker. I am the Associate Curator for African Art here at the museum. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the second presentation in a series of 3. And for this series, we've basically invited 3 leading curators in African art to come visit us in Ann Arbor, come and look at the collections with us, come and see the galleries and the display spaces to help us think and talk through an upcoming reinstallation of our permanent Africa gallery and collection. During their visit, they also work with students at the university who have, throughout the semester, been involved in reimagining the display of our permanent gallery. Tonight, I am very pleased to welcome Pamela McClusky, the curator of African and Oceanic art from the Seattle Art Museum. She's one of the leading curators in our field and has created several exhibitions that have pushed our thinking about the display of the arts of Africa and beyond into new, exciting realms. Just to mention some names, she has worked extensively with contemporary artists like Fred Wilson, Nick Cave, Yinka Shonibari, but she has also, and perhaps more importantly, extensively worked with representatives of the numerous cultures and communities that are represented in the Africa collections at her museum. Ray Silverman, UMMA's longtime colleague and the co-organizer of this series, will give a more formal introduction to Pam shortly, but I can already assure you that we are in for a real treat tonight. We hope you will also be able to join us for the final program in this series. Krista Clarke, who is the 3rd curator we invited, will be discussing her work, the work that she's done at Newark Museum on Thursday, November 30th, which will also take place at 7 p.m. here in the Helmut Stern Auditorium. The speaker series coincides with our exhibition Power Contained, the Art of Authority in Central and West Africa, which is on display on the Brandon Bridge throughout the end of December. And this exhibition also exemplifies some of the principles of display and interpretation that we are investigating in this series. The exhibition and the series would not be possible without the generous support of several of our partners: the University of Michigan African Studies Center, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, the Department of History of Art, the Institute for the Humanities, the Museum Studies Program, and the University of Michigan Office of the Provost. Thank you. During tonight's program, we will hear from our distinguished speaker, who has also agreed to take some questions at the end of her presentation. But to properly introduce Pam, I would like to welcome Ray Silverman to the stage after a very short intro. Ray Silverman, professor in History of Art, African Studies, and Museum Studies, is a specialist of the visual cultures of Ghana and Ethiopia. He has published several books and edited several volumes on the arts of both countries, and is currently working on a monograph titled Icons of Devotion, Icons of Trade, Contemporary Painting in the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia. He has also curated numerous exhibitions, amongst which Painting Ethiopia, the life and work of Kesadamu Tesfa, which was first shown at the Fowler Museum in 2005, and African Art in the Shape of Time, which was shown here at UMMA in 2013. When Ray is not curating, teaching, or researching, you can find him flying his drone over archaeological sites in Sudan, for which he became a licensed pilot last year. Please join me in welcoming Ray, who will in turn introduce our speaker for the evening. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, she was threatening to share a bit of intimate information with you. Not many people before now knew that I flew drones. So. They're non-weaponized, though, just cameras. Pam McClusky and I have known one another for a while. In 1975, we both arrived in Seattle to begin our graduate studies in African art history at the University of Washington. A short time later, Pam found herself interning at the Seattle Art Museum. I'll refer to the museum as SAM. The museum then had a modest collection of African art, respectable, but really not anything to write home about. Within a year, Pam was appointed curatorial assistant in ethnic art and was charged with curating the arts of Africa, Oceania, and Indigenous Americas. Her title gives you some idea of the status of these collections at SAM at the time. Then in 1980, something extraordinary happened. One of the world's great private collections of African art, assembled by Catherine Reswick White, was gifted to the Seattle Art Museum. Virtually overnight, SAM held one of the most important collections of African art in the world, and Pam McClusky was its curator. She was promoted to Associate Curator of African, Oceanic, and Indonesian Art in 1980, and in 1996 became Curator of African and Oceanic Art. Over the last 40 years, Pam has done remarkable things at SAM and beyond, continuing to enhance the museum's collections and curating no less than 50 exhibits. Some of the exhibits were gallery installations, some were large, major temporary exhibitions, some traveled to other venues. All have been significant. Pam has been fortunate to work at an institution, the Seattle Art Museum, that has had, for the most part, supportive, open-minded directors who have let Pam do her thing, within limits, of course. She has been able to experiment, to press the exhibitionary envelope, while developing new interpretive strategies for exhibiting the visual cultures of Africa and the Pacific. In doing so, she has, for some time now, been one of the field's most innovative curators. One of the most challenging undertakings a curator of Africa faces is developing exhibitions that present and represent the continent, yes, the entire continent of Africa, using only objects from the museum at which she or he works. In fact, this is the challenge Laura is now grappling with, a challenge that has afforded us an opportunity to bring Pam McClusky to the University of Michigan to share the insights that have emerged from her curatorial experience. In fact, Pam, having been faced with this challenge at SAM, has produced such exhibitions several times. Two in particular reveal the creativity she brings to her curatorial practice. The first was Praise Poems, the Catherine White collection that she curated in 1984, which celebrated the collection that had recently been gifted to the museum, as well as the person who had created it. The second, Art from Africa, Long Steps Never Broke a Back, produced roughly 20 years later, was particularly special as it presented a vast range of visual expression organized around a set of provocative themes. Both exhibitions traveled to other venues, including the National Museum of African Art, Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Kimball Art Museum, and the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Pam produced books to accompany each exhibition. The book, Prepared for Long Steps, was more than a catalog. It presented a set of beautifully written essays that offer substantive, sensitive readings of African objects and their multiple meanings. My colleague here at U of M, David Doris, and I have both used the book as a primary text for our courses in African art. To use an exhibition publication in such a context is in fact rare. Sadly, the book's out of print. Here are the titles of a few of Pam's most recent exhibitions, again, giving you a little bit of insight into what she's about. African Renaissances and Emblems of Encounter. Mood Indigo, Textiles from Around the World. Disguise, Masks and Global African Art. Transtextuality in Contemporary African Art. And Ancestral Modern, Australian Aboriginal Art. Pam enjoys collaboration and is good at it. Indeed, it is one of the hallmarks of her curatorial practice. She has worked on installations with visual artists, as Lori has mentioned, such as Fred Wilson, also Nick Cave, and Alice Wood. She has also worked with performance artists and with individuals in the community, in particular Seattle's African diaspora community, in developing many of the shows she has curated at SAM. All of her work is directed at providing people with the opportunities to experience and better understand Africa through its expressive cultures. Pam is what I call a thoughtful curator. Though she stays very busy curating Africa and Oceania at SAM, she on occasion finds or makes time to reflect upon her practice, to write about what it is she does. As I mentioned a moment ago, several of her major exhibitions have been accompanied with book-length publications. She also has written critical essays on a range of issues. Here are a couple for existence. Why is this here? Museum labels as ethical guides. And The Unconscious Museum, collecting contemporary African art without knowing it. Though our careers have taken us in different directions, I have followed Pam's closely and am a great admirer of the pioneering work she has undertaken at SAM and in the Seattle community. Every time I go to Seattle, I spend time at the Art Museum to see what she's been up to. I've never been disappointed. I am absolutely delighted that she has come to visit with us for a couple of days to work with Laura and her colleagues here at UMMA, as well as our students, as we begin to reimagine the African Gallery here in the museum. Please join me in welcoming Pamela McClusky.
Well, I wish my mom. Hear me now? Yeah? All right. And I'm noticing this screen is kind of doing a little jiggle dance. Maybe it's just activating our awareness of what it's about to reveal, but I guess we'll get used to that. But welcome. These welcomes have been incredible. Thank you so much. I'm glad to be able to spend some time. They had me talk about past exhibitions with students today, but then gave me the assignment to envision the ideal African art installation, and I have to say, spoiler alert, I don't have that to offer you, because I totally subscribe to the Ray Silverman school of thought, which is that museums are a process. They're not an end. They are a process that we constantly work with, questioning what a museum can be, what culture is, how we present it the best way we can, and those ideas are going to be part of what I offer today as a process rather than a finished product. I, of course, come from Seattle and spend more time on the West Coast, so the first thing I wanted to offer you were a couple of tech tips. The heartland of technology is constantly finding ways to kind of urge us to communicate differently and to consume a lot. We are the homeland of Amazon, which I hear Detroit may be looking forward to, perhaps. But the tech world is something that is a constant presence. So I just picked two ideas to get us started. And the first comes from the work of a photographer, Peter DeCampo. And Peter is someone who has recently moved to Seattle, but was living in Africa and has been on assignment for many years as a photojournalist. And as a photojournalist, he would be given the task to go, and this was part of an article being written about where does our cocoa come from? Where does the chocolate in the world come from? Which, of course, Ivory Coast is one of the suppliers, as is Ghana. So he takes a picture like this. Then he was asked to take a photo essay about a recent aftermath of civil conflict in the Ivory Coast. So this is the picture of a man who is returning to a house they had left a year before to find it completely destroyed. Then he takes a picture like this, and this is the one that is, not as graphic as a few of the others, but this is from an article about the fiery serpent, i.e. the guinea worm, that has been taken from this young girl's hand, and she's being bandaged. But as you can see, she's not having a very good time of it. And then he has photographed things like this. Tractors that have not been repaired, that fall into disarray and just are growing into the landscape. And to counteract how many things like this he found, he started a What Went Wrong Foundation, which is analyzing the amount of aid coming from NGOs and other government agencies that doesn't work in Africa, and why. How can we analyze that? How can we learn from it? And Peter works on things like this constantly, but then was coming back to the United States and became concerned that the image of Africa through the eyes of photojournalism in the United States is extremely tainted. So he worked on a project in schools where he went into the schools and asked the teachers to ask students what they thought of Africa in one word. And here is one example of what they came up with. Bad, hunger, poverty, scarce resources, war, dry, giraffe. So the bad giraffe continent, which is an emblem of the fact that there has not been enough direct connection with the continent, and people tend to fall back on fantasies and stereotypes, and the distance that this creates is truly harmful. So he decided to do something about it. He went into Instagram and worked out a way to call 30 photographers across the continent to submit photographs that they took for their own reasons and their own ways of expressing what they see going on in an everyday context. So you get something like these kids rolling across a hillside. You get a young woman who is going about her job as a barrister on her way to work in Abuja. You get a group of women all going off to a wedding on the back of motorcycles in the DRC. A group of models having their fingernails, look at those fingernails, put on before they hit the runway in a fashion show in Kinshasa. This young refugee who's going to play checkers but happens to have a sweater that matches the checkerboard, and then the most wonderful, I think it's a hairstyle or maybe a fur piece that's covering his head. And then things like Christmas at Lalibela in Ethiopia. So from all over the continent, I don't know how many of you may be familiar with this, but you can log on and see images like this that just take you into a very different framework for what Africa is about. This is a group of students waiting to be able to get a signal on the Wi-Fi next to their school. And then you get something like this, exam week. How many of you have ever seen this kind of imagery? Students cramming their brains out trying to get through an exam, some of them like, oh my gosh, and you can identify with these kinds of images that just provide you with a totally different frame than the usual photojournalism that's way too prevalent. So Peter said he just wanted to provide, and he continues to work with Instagram. This is an ongoing live feed constantly coming up. And he also has developed a book that was just published that has selections from many of these photographs, but also the kinds of commentary that have come up online where people in the United States are reacting to this and going, wait a minute, are you sure is this really in Africa? I can't quite believe it. And then the photographers adding their commentary about it as well. But somehow, somewhere within a context of a gallery for African art, having a kind of check-in with what's going on in the everyday seems like something that might be worth trying. The second tech tip comes from an event that I attended at Stanford and the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco just this time last year. And it was about a topic that I was immediately interested in because I've never had the chance to go to Tehran. It was called Art, Social Space, and Public Discourse in Iran. And it was advertised as having an event at the Asian Art Museum, so I arrived a little bit early. And what they were doing was setting up a big lobby space with a full screen about as large as this, with a simulcast broadcast in a coffee house in Tehran. It was very early in the morning in Tehran, and this event was starting rather late, but you got to walk in and feel like you were in Tehran, and you were going to be able to have conversations across the continents in the midst of this presentation. The main basis of the presentation was a storyteller, singer, who was narrating the Shahnameh. And she talked, the students had all studied the fact that, and I wasn't aware of this, of the giant murals that are available in Tehran. So they were being broadcast in the background. And then the students that were in the US could help us who were in the audience understand more about the mural tradition by talking about how they'd looked at the murals that were in Iran and that they had recently actually made one themselves in Palo Alto. And this sense of exchange and engagement was just palpable in the room. And they were guiding us, and then the audience in Tehran was able to field our questions live, simulcast. It was truly just like being there. They also had talked with students who were doing different kinds of public art in private situations because the public art in Tehran is primarily devoted to imagery of the leaders, as you can see on the right. But this range of cross-fertilization through Skyping virtually, large scale, brought me to thinking about how our classrooms are social spaces and what would be possible if you were to have simulcast Skyping that took on a different dimension. And in fact, this is a classroom in Accra, Ghana, that is part of a university called Eshesi, where they're fully equipped and ready to do this. So why not? Why not be able to have that kind of exchange? Because I think the conversations that you have across the boundaries are so vital to getting to know the world in a better way. Kind Foundation last week just announced that they are actually engaging in this kind of work. Microsoft happens to want to help anyone who's willing to use Skype in a new way. So they worked a deal to do something called Empatigo, and it will be providing the technology and the assistance for classrooms to be able to do this kind of exchange over the next few years, and we'll wait and see what comes of it. But the other thing that Kind has done, and Kind is, you know those little healthy nut bars? So when you buy those, you can have some goodness in your heart because it's going to the profits are going to something that is taking on the world in a different way. In this year, they did a project called Pop Your Bubble, which is challenging Americans to add diverse perspectives to their Facebook feeds. So that's another project to look at. But I think this notion of taking Skype to provide a point of access is something that I would love to work on, and am trying to find ways to think about it happening in Seattle. But ultimately, Ray and Laura said there was no budget to constrain my ideas of dreaming of a new African art gallery. So the next thing I think we all need to do is just go. We'll all go to Africa. I talked with Oprah, so there are tickets under all of your seats. And we need to go because there is a factor in travel that is borne out by statistics. The amount of money spent by US travelers on travel in 2016 was $246 billion. But look at that diagram at the top. What is wrong with that picture of the world? All of it, the vast majority of it, is going to cities in the northern hemisphere. How many people get to Africa as compared to how many get to London, Paris, Rome, Toronto, Vancouver, Barcelona, Montreal? You get the picture. There's also another statistic in that foreign aid is really so much less than is spent on travel. So what you get, this is the 2016 budget, and we've all heard about Trump's new budget, which he is calling the cut, cut, cut plan. But we wonder what it will be. But how much we spend on travel is so overwhelming compared to what is spent by our government on aid. So we've got some work to do. So we would look at an expedition going to Africa, but need to not be glossy like the National Geographic expeditions. And I've actually been on a couple of these, but they are meant for a certain kind of travel that I think we need to almost grow beyond right now. They are a kind of travel that we also need to look at is the expedition of art history, which has some terrible episodes. The top is a British punitive expedition from 1897 that basically cleaned out an entire palace in Nigeria. Or on the bottom is the expedition of porters that followed Teddy Roosevelt. He retired at the age of 50, having been president. He was the youngest retired president. And he roared off to Africa with his son Kermit, and he shot more animals and collected more artwork and had it transported to the US than anyone could ever have imagined possible. So we're not going to do this kind of expedition. We're also not going to follow the French model. This book has just come out called Phantom Africa. Oh my gosh. Reading the thoughts of Michel Lieris, it's a little horrifying, but something that's a cautionary tale. As is the cautionary tale of the perception of travel as a time when you basically, photograph everything and dance for a few minutes with people around you, but really are not following how you're creating an impression of travelers as people who only want to take photos and walk away quickly, or people who want to collect from roadside stands and don't spend time learning about the art worlds that they are going in and out of. So with all of those cautionary tales, what I do want to talk about is the idea of all of us going on this expedition and what it would be like. Because I do think that as curators, we have the privilege to do this, but we often wonder what we're missing as we wander and what we might do differently. And having a few fresh witnesses couldn't hurt. So you'll need to get your passports ready. Oprah's tickets are waiting. And you get to go and see what it would be like to take a fast trip through this gigantic, exceedingly diverse continent full of outrageously creative people. First step, 154. 154 is one continent, 54 countries, a contemporary art fair. The next one is the first time it'll be in Marrakesh or on the African continent. And it is an art fair that started 3 years ago and has gone strong. It has mostly been in London and New York, but it is this next time going to be in this Shishi La wonderful hotel. And this is an art fair that is a gathering point for artists, galleries, dealers, collectors. Some of the artists get an entire gallery so they can outfit it with furniture that they design and then have a large-scale showcase. Other galleries send representative examples of several artists, each on their own. And then we'll talk with the people who have established the backbone of this kind of art fair. On the left is Touria, and she founded 154, and she is born and raised in Morocco. Her father is an artist. She was educated in the United States. She began a career in the banking industry as a wealth management consultant. She is listed among the 100 most powerful women in Africa by Forbes magazine. And she's seated next to an elder now artist, Roulette Wheel. Then Marianne Ibrahim is a gallerist who's based in Seattle but travels the world. And then Bartholomew Togu. But you'll be meeting people like this on a very quick basis, and then you get to have your head filled with visions and conversations with gallerists, artists, and they are coming from all over the continent. So you'll see something from an artist. This happens to be a woman from Madagascar, and I met her at the art fair last year. She takes emblems and collages them from all kinds of insignia and royal records, and this one is called Memories 1816, so she researches intersections, makes that possible. Mary Sabande kind of invents Amazonian-style women who are taking on inequalities. Ida Malona, an Ethiopian who has done a lot with portraiture. Fabrice Montero, who is a Benin Belgian photographer and has done a series about the consequences of climate disasters. And this is a Benin sculptor who uses Benin car parts to create new masks. And this is Ibrahim Mahana. I hear he did something at the Broad around this part of the country. And then Mohau, and this is part of a 17-minute video called Passage. But in the course of all this, your mind starts spinning like a roulette wheel because you're meeting artists, you're seeing new work. It is just really tough to keep track. But your quest is to find who is the artist that is going to stand out. Of all of these, negotiate a price. It's a fairly tense time, and there are ways that some of the curators are kind of vying for deals to be made that cause you to kind of shake your head and wonder what there is that causes this compulsion to collect quickly, because I'm more of the slow museum movement style person. But this is the world that is now established and is now very, very much a part of the way that the continent is seeing art. But we'll go from Marrakesh down to Accra because we can visit with Patrick Anwa, who I've gotten to know. He is retired from Microsoft with enough funding to go back to Ghana and establish his own university. He did this and has been able to keep it going since 2002. And he tends to focus on technology, as you can imagine, but he has very high principles, very courageous thinker, wanting to make definite change on the continent, and has modeled this university to create new leaders for the continent, has been very successful at doing so. But we would enter that classroom. This is the kind of classroom he's been able to establish and talk with them about different types of exchange and the possibility of working with this kind of younger generation who have the sense of being interrogative thinkers but are not aligned with the art world as much. They're coming at it from different angles, and we'd be able to ask them about the issues of marketplace and trade and perceptions of African aid, and then what artists are working within veins that they are interested in. So what is of interest to them as compared to the interests we have in what Africans produce? From Ghana, we go to Nigeria. where I was in March. Lagos is one of the great all-time cities of sheer intensity. We'd go from this to maybe a nightclub, and then we'd go to looking around. I loved finding this mobile oil guy's pump where he said he's a pump assistant, but he's also a red velvet cake master. You never know how people are going to identify. We'd go through one of the galleries. This is Nikkei Gallery, which is almost like a shopping mall filled with art of all kinds. We'd need to meet up with B.C. Silva because she is one of the leading lights and wonderful interrogative thinkers in this field. But ultimately, we'd also kind of be able to do some shopping if you're into that. This is a shop that has been designed by David Adjaye, who is the designer for the new African American Museum on the Smithsonian Mall. And this is my friend Yemisi, who she was able to buy only one thing but tried on all the sunglasses. But meanwhile, we'd be aiming to go upcountry to a little town called Erin Austin to meet with a very different kind of artists. These are artists that are not in that ultra-urban, singular star artist or high-stakes art world. These are artists who, on occasion, have been able to come to the United States. This is a tour we did during that time of Long Steps in Philadelphia. But I've known them since they were, young ones over the years. The young daughter there is now a grown mother herself. But they are the kinds of artists that I think get left out of that bigger art world endeavor. And they are continuing to practice and involve themselves in carrying on tradition and adapting it to the present day. The man in the middle, standing tall, I knew as a gangly teenager who could barely get through anything without having a lot of difficulty, and he's now the commanding center of a group of about 40 of the best drummers you're ever going to hear. And then they welcome and proceed to call out a sequence of performers in different styles of disguise, who all often are singing and providing commentary. At times, this singer actually had messages for our president. The impact of Donald Trump on our international profile is extremely evident in many situations. And at this, out in this small village, being able to hear what they thought they should say to him was quite something. Then they also have these wonderful, these are called beings from beyond, who are meant to come into our realm and remind us that occasionally we have to go beyond the limitations of being human and elevate to another level. So we would listen to them, watch them. This is some of the best performance art I think you can ever find. And then we'd sit at the end of it by a tree with a lot of the leaders, a lot of the community gathering to ask about what we're up to, compare notes with them. This is another performer who remained in disguise because he was also talking truth to power, i.e. the chief that's around the corner. But they have asked two friends of mine and I that could they be able to set up a small school for the performing arts, which is something that we're now beginning to entertain, and it becomes this give and take of working slowly and over many years with people that you form a bond with, and hopefully it goes vice versa. Next, we'd sneak around the cities to get to a tall hilltop called Lycom, a little city where all of this art came from. And I was so concerned when this first came into the museum because in a way it's everything that you would put in a throne room for the king. So I wrote the king and I said, what are we supposed to do with all of this in Seattle? And he said, well, let me send Gilbert. So Gilbert, who is his grandson, interviewed all the palace officials. I'd sent photographs of our collection to him. They all presented their ideas about it to Gilbert. He came to the United States. He's since remained in the United States and is in graduate school, but he and I have to check in with the king periodically. The king looks over all the writing and all of the commentary that comes back, and then the palace officials often spend hours talking about what they are concerned about and how they are glad that their kingdom is being shown in another place, but they're worried about how long the belief system that surrounds this palace is going to remain intact. So you have a lot of long, slow, very involved conversations, and yet you can see there's a wonderful sense of exchange and dynamic between all the people involved. So from this little tiny hilltop with these quiet conversations, we then would go to Cape Town, South Africa. Cape Town is the place to go in the art world on the continent right now because this giant museum just opened in September. And there are numerous kind of discussions about it online because one of the things that's most remarkable is it was a former grain silo, and that grain silo has been adapted to this honeycomb pattern of galleries. These galleries are all devoted to contemporary African art, and it is a giant step in recognizing the creativity of this region of Africa. South Africa, of course, is a place with dichotomy, like many places, the have and the have-nots, those who are still feeling the residue of the apartheid system, and then the post-apartheid artists who are able to come up with a vital way of commenting on their own terms. So we would be looking at what's there, recognizing how it is fit into this incredible city. This is a sculpture by Nicholas Hobo made out of rubber that drapes over an interior atrium. And then we'd be going to visit with artists like Atri Pataruga, who is a performance artist par excellence. And there he is in his blue overalls, but he also does tapestries of a fictional nation that he has created called Azania. And you'll see Krista in the middle. She is your next speaker. We traveled together in South Africa. She also is looking at the bottom left at a true monumental piece that was a breakthrough in art history in South Africa, the Butcher Boys. You don't live until you see those guys. Then there's the studio of Penny Siopis, a professor artist on the bottom right, another artist who's created this wonderful maze of lumber that's created a black fortress before you can get into the main gallery. And then we go on to Johannesburg and visit with Walter Altman, who I hear you've acquired a piece by Walter. He has grand caterpillar suits like the one on the interior on the right, and then some are placed outdoors in incredible sculpture parks like Nyrox. Then we look in Johannesburg. Some of the texts that you find in South Africa are amidst the most forceful language to take on difficult subjects. And I always appreciate going there, and I so appreciated when I came here and saw that Laura has used one of the main lessons that I learned on my last trip, which is when you say artists unknown is what is usually said in many places, and you're saying artists unrecorded, and that is truly a shift that is significant to acknowledge. In Johannesburg, we'd also get tickets to performances being given at the Center for the Less Good Idea. This is a place that was established by the artist William Kentridge, a phenomenally successful artist who put funding into what he said was often a problem, that artists have the ideas they get funding for, and then they have these ideas they really want to do, but they can't because they can never get anyone to support them. So he's supporting this fulcrum point for collaboration that goes across all disciplines, and they've had 2 seasons, and everyone talks about what this is opening up in this amazing city. Then we'd also look for a good coffee shop to do one of those Skype sessions with. And there are incredible coffee shops like this one in South Africa. But from the hustle and bustle of these cities in South Africa, next we go to Kenya. And we go to Kenya, but we would avoid this version, which is the kind of National Geographic or animal photo safari version, which is all too common. And instead, we'd have the chance to go and visit with Kakuta Hamisi and the Marawishi community. Kakuta came to the Seattle Art Museum as an intern, And he was able to orchestrate a very unusual exchange. On the left, you can see him gathering artwork that the community all donated to a place called a museum, because he asked our trustees for enough money to build a school, at least one classroom school, and he wanted to start with that. And it enabled him to build relationships that have since filled out an entire school project, as well as a clinic, as well as a place for the cattle to be taken care of. But Kakuta and his community are really doing incredible work. This is, they keep getting trophies in some of the competitive exams that are given in Kenya. And this is on a few of the walls, it has, "This building was funded by children from Seattle." And that sense of being involved and being able to see the fruits of years of investment and collaboration is really something to celebrate. And we would celebrate because Kakuta has also enabled us to get to know the names of all of the beading artists who contributed to the collection. And I kind of asked him to go back and record each of them and then translate their commentary. So we have that as part of our collection record. And all too often, the Maasai have been pretty much ostracized as very photogenic people, but not being given the time and the effort to document exactly what goes into the choices that they make in what ornaments they provide. And they are wonderful singers. And they're singing right now. Kakuta just told me it's serious drought time in Kenya. So there's very great concern because the herders need to get the cattle, their beloved cattle, to grazing land. And to do that, they often are now moving into some of the reserves that are mostly for people, tourists who come and want to see lions and wildebeest and all those giraffes, and are very distressed when they see cattle, which is, of course, a prejudice that we bring to this part of the world. But then we finished our expedition and we turned to a museum. And there is something that always happens to me when I walk through the galleries and I think about how still and quiet, and in a way how it's kind of discouraging, because there's no sense of the people that made these works, what they had to say, what their singing is like. And then you watch people walk by these cases and it's just like they're looking at necklaces in a department store. And it is really hard. The first few weeks that I'm back in the museum, I definitely have to be careful what I say, because it's a hard transition. That culture shock is very real. And I think I feel it the most when I look at masks, because in a way these are like heads without bodies, agents of so much character that are never meant to be seen still and quiet. And there they sit, no voice, no activation, and they seem forlorn and almost like refugees. But along the way, I do have to admit, I'm in a museum, and occasionally I go to a place. This is at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and I walked through, and they had this giant gallery that just had these 5 pieces in it, and it's comparing 5 bodies. And I thought there was some value in this sense of, recognizing that there's a formal analysis that can go on, but there you've got, Louise Bourgeois' sculpture, an Egyptian sculpture, an African sculpture, and they're all keeping company together in a kind of shrine to elegant elongation. But I'm still not sure this is the way I would prefer to go. So what I wanted to talk about now is how can you get interactivity involved in a gallery? And these are photos from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, which has transformed their digital program to establish ways for audiences to connect with the content in the gallery. They have a huge photographic collection, so they've done a lot with that. They have a mix of touch screens, and every time I've been there, a young one has insisted that I help him figure something out. that idea of they're taking this on and they want to make connections themselves. And it is truly a time of reckoning for all of us about how, when we know that people will walk by a work of art and in 3 to 15 seconds decide if they're going to give it the time of day, how do we engage in different ways? One of the ideas that I am hoping to be able to work on is the idea of not the written labels like the ones you see on the left, but a living label. A label that would be multimedia, be available. I'm not quite sure where and how in the gallery, but I'm starting to work with someone to produce a few of them so that we could have a way of connecting that goes beyond the written record. And I just went through your collection and started to look at how quickly, if you move from what's in the museum and look online, something like this Eshu figure has ramifications that go on and on when you look via the internet. You can see on the right different ideas of how to convey the importance of something, a character like Eshu. Up on the left, Eshu is the subject of many, many stories, so he gets treated in an illustrative way. But then on the bottom right is the beginning of a blog that is so persuasively written by a man from the US who decided to go to Nigeria and to try and find his way through to visit Eshu shrines. And he did it with a lot of forethought and consideration. So he went on this pilgrimage and he made sure that he visited the palace of the Oba to pay homage. He presented offerings to Eshu. He went by Eshu's ancient house in the sacred grove. And then someone told him, you've got to switch off all your mobile devices. You're not going to be allowed to take any pictures. And he noticed that other people around him didn't follow this prescription. He proceeded through, had a wonderful exchange, and then ended up back in Oshogbo and turned back on his device, whereas everyone else around him could never get their phone to work again, convincing everyone that Eshu has this capacity to follow what you're doing and make things happen if you're not careful. Then if you have an Ibeji, Ibejis are created to honor a twin who has died. But what about having a conversation with a dad, a Yoruba dad who has just brought 2 twins into the world, and the joyousness with which twins are received, and then the hurtfulness of when one dies, what do you do? So you invest in a sculpture like this that can go on an altar and be given the time and given the recognition and given a sense of belonging in your household. Or you could take your ebon sword and return it to the hands of the official that can use it in the midst of a ceremony. And there have been many ceremonies over the course of the last few months because there has been a coronation of a new king in this area. And to see that sword spun and activated is an entirely different experience than seeing it quiet and still. And I often have to give credit to Al Jazeera compared to the amount of time most Americans spend learning about who Prince Harry is holding hands with or what Queen Elizabeth is up to. How many times have you heard about the Oba of Benin? If you go to Al Jazeera, they have extensive coverage of his coronation. Did any of you know this was going on? It happened October 20th, 2016. This crown prince at the top right, who is wearing coral bead regalia that is like that in the sculpture that is here, he was named the new Oba and given the name Iweri II, named after Iweri the Great, who had city walls for this kingdom built in the 15th century. Banners about this flew all over Benin City, and this monarch remains an extremely respected power in Nigeria. And then on the bottom, you can see members of the royal household who all wear the royal red coral beads in wonderful headdresses that they create for these kinds of occasions. Then you have a Sheree Peters piece that I noticed is a lovely notion of how to take a crown. And evidently she did a project in both Harlem and Harare. And the crown appears as a kind of metaphor for self-determination. And on the left, you have the image of not exactly a crown, but a woman of determination being photographed by Fabrice Montero. And she is signifying a period of time when Senegalese women were basically creating their own culture at the time of the slave trade. And this is actually photographed inside the governor's palace in Dakar. And she has created a sense of herself that includes this lovely extending head tie out of gold metallic cloth, and then is smoking a pipe to add to her kind of hauteur. Then there's the notion of body ornamentation. You have this incredible baule piece on the left, but how is body art being seen around the world right now? On the right are two images from the University of Washington. I was mentioning today that a number of Tahitian and Samoan students were brought to play on the football team, and yet were quite annoyed that they were portrayed and perceived as being only football players, when in fact they are conveyors of their culture. And they did a study at the University of Washington's Burke Museum about the body art that they carry and what its significance is. So looking at the body art of the baule, how could you transfer that to look at body art in general? Ray could help you get this manuscript page read aloud and talked about. This is a man in Oxon. This is from one of those Everyday Africa images. And you have these incredible power figures that are about, resolving conflict and dispute. But how about if they were paired with a painting like this by Sheree Samba that shows resolution and difficulty trying to happen, but under a vice that's squeezing these two poor men's heads together while one has his foot on top of American dollars and French francs. And then Sheree always adds the whole notion of what this is about with texts in the bottom right. But basically, this is the dispute between an employer and the employee. Then there are images of animals. How do artists work with the notion of animals as a point of character departure that can be learned from? And that crosses many boundaries in many cultures. And there are contemporary artists like Sanford Biggers who created wonderful personas of masquerading elements in the United States that could be used to talk about some of the imagery and the natural materials that appear on certain other masked forms. Then this is an artist who has adapted Cuba style from textiles into a graphic, photographic medium, and then hiding behind the Cuba imagery that is an overlay is the face of a notorious dictator, King Leopold of Belgium, who's responsible for probably more deaths in Africa at the turn of the century than we ever can acknowledge. Or you have this incredible Igungun head, and then there are Igungun performers who travel the United States and adapt Igungun ideology to contemporary circumstances, like this on the right with Nelson Mandela waving as one of our great ancestors. Or you can ask artists to come in and create their own method of disrupting the usual order. This is Wura Natasha Ogunji, and she created her own version of a Cuba mask and asked to position herself in the middle of our European galleries. She sat there for many hours and said her action was just going to be called Kissing the Mask. anyone who wanted to could come in and kiss this mask. She remains silent throughout this process, but she accounts for the fact that everyone coming up to kiss her talked to her and told her things that were quite revealing and truly astonishing to her. She has since, she did this for the first time in Seattle. She's since done it in numerous museums across Europe. But the idea of having the artist have an agency to do something completely out of the ordinary with the sense of engaging the audience has been a very, very welcome thing to do. And lastly, I'm going to turn back to that idea of Skyping and being able to have a simulcast, perhaps, from the Center for the Less Good Idea in Johannesburg, and giving those who may not be able to travel to Africa at least a sense of what it might be like to be there for a few moments in the evening, to watch what happens there, and to hear directly from the creative force of this incredibly inspiring continent. So thank you for listening.